when you start trying to build bridges, you're vulnerable, not just that the other side rejects your overtures or lies to you or doesn't follow through on commitments, but you're also vulnerable within your own organizations, within your own communities and base.
On December 5th, I joined President Obama on stage to talk about how we bridge our differences at this very polarized and divided time. As you know, we're on a mission to reach political leaders from across the spectrum because we got to talk to everybody about a mission that is needed for our country. Let's hear how the conversation went.
So here's my first question. All of you are doing work in this pivotal moment in very different contexts, but you're all grappling with some of the polarization division that we've been talking about at this forum. So just start off by telling me what's your basic approach, and give me maybe a brief sense of what you found most successful in what you've been trying to do and what hasn't worked so well.
I'm grateful for everybody listening about this subject because I want to bring us back to a day that changed the trajectory of my life. So, President Obama, as I was hearing your speech and I was hearing us thinking through the subject, the one question that's been on my mind today is the question, how close are we actually to pluralism? How close are we? Because, you know, we can think through and talk about, should we have this conversation? Should we be pluralistic? Should we reach across the aisle? But I'm really curious about how close is this country? So I was a pre-med student. I had no interest in politics or democracy, any of this stuff. My mom's still confused. That's why I brought her to this event. And I want to thank you for you making the strong case for why this work matters. You know, February 2nd, 2017, I was a freshman at UC Berkeley. I was walking back from my math seminar, and there was protests in the distance and violence. And now this is Berkeley, so that's sort of par for the course. There's nothing special about that. But what was different about that moment was I was walking past this cafe, and inside the window was broken in. It said CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech. Now, again, I was not some political expert, so I didn't really know what that meant. But what was crazy about that moment was that the television crew that was filming that was standing right next to me. And that was sort of the breaking of the fourth wall. That's where I went from feeling like a spectator to, all right, we got to try and do something about this situation. Now, those protests happened because a speaker came to campus, and the next day, me and some random folks, one of whom my co-founder and best friend Ross Irwin was in the audience, we got together, and we said, let's create a space for the protesters and the protested to have a conversation. Now, you're sitting here, you know, we're having this conversation 7 years later. That's a very naive proposition. After the largest protests in Berkeley's history since the 60s, when Dr. King came to campus, we're gonna try to, not political experts, we're gonna try to get some of the most extremes in a conversation in a week after that. Well, we showed up, and you had that feeling in this room, right, where everyone is walking on eggshells. There's people that you can tell there's anger in their eyes. They're showing up with their fists clenched. People are not really sure where this conversation is going to go, and you certainly have the sense of, what's the point of all of this? What's the point of all of this? This conversation starts, and my friend Ross had a really smart idea. He said, what if we forget politics for a second? Let's just talk about who we are as people. Like, forget why you invited the speaker, forget, you know, why why we protested the speaker, what the limits of free speech are. You know, let's talk about our moms. Let's talk about our family. Let's talk about, why are you actually in college? Why did you skip class? You know, what drives you? And man, that vulnerability cut through human ignorance like a knife through hot butter. I learned one thing that day, and that is that we radically overestimate how divided we are, and we radically underestimate the power of a conversation. So I'll just wrap with this, which is, as we think about how close we actually are, I think we live at this time where we've let the worst caricatures of the other side define everybody on the other side. And the question becomes, well, what do we actually do about it? And my proposition would be that the chapters that we're building across the country and these student leaders that we're working with, as they're executing and organizing these dialogues, they're finding that most people in the real world are not the Twitter mob. And so the question becomes, how do you elevate that silent majority? And the way that I see my work is, how do you build a real movement? around dialogue and pluralism, not as a defensive activity, but as this tool for actually thinking about how you're going to pull off, as you were articulating, the most ambitious democratic experiment in the history of humanity.
That's terrific. As I know all of you are familiar with, the statistics bear out, the surveys bear out what all of you are saying, that even in this deeply polarized moment, and I'm most familiar, obviously, with the statistics here in the United States, the most extreme, not only viewpoints, but also the most extreme attitudes towards the other side are actually among this small group that is most actively engaged and involved. And the people who are not actively engaged and involved actually do not jibe with any of this stuff. Don't even really track many of these disagreements and are just a bundle of contradictions, which, by the way, we all are. Certainly I am. And so that is a powerful starting point. I do want to ask, though, because all of you told sort of heartwarming stories, I want to ask about when you feel like you've kind of made a mistake in this process, either because you made assumptions about somebody, like your, hardcore mayor friend, or that turned out to be disproven. But you might want to also talk about the fact that, well, sometimes you make an assumption that we have something in common and somebody disappoints you, or or for whatever reason, maybe because you approached it, you never were able to build the sort of relationship you were hoping for, and what you learned from that. I just think that hope is honest, and I think it's important for us not to underestimate some of the barriers and challenges when we try to get people not just to tolerate each other, but potentially work together.
Yeah, I mean, the first mistake I made was not being a doctor.
Are you still playing to your mom here?
I'm still playing to my
Okay.
mom. There was a strategic objective, and Anka and Nico know this very well. When there's something you said in your 3 judgments, Anka, about and 3 rules, and one of them was suspend judgment. And what's so powerful about that is it actually goes back to one of the first mistakes we had made, President Obama, doing this work, which was I saw it not for what it was, which was that pluralism is a way to see people the way they are and to actually understand not what they believe, but why they believe. Instead, I immediately jumped to it as a political tool to achieve my end. Now, I don't think that it can't be a political tool to achieve people's ends, but the one thing that I've learned over the last 7 years hosting these conversations, hosting these dialogues, is that people can sniff out your goal very quickly. And if we show up to a conversation with the idea being that I'm going to try to convince those people to come to my side in the next 45 minutes, I'm sorry to put a damper on this, but that's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is because, as you articulated, we're in a very divided moment where people fundamentally have applied the worst caricatures of myself to everybody on my side. And so as a result, the question becomes, well, if that's how people are approaching the conversation, how do we actually engage productively? And I think one of our students actually taught me this way of thinking, and this came after actually the October 7th attacks, where if you think about college campuses, you would imagine that college campuses are permanently set aflame. And yet our chapters hosted over 25 discussions about Israel-Palestine over the last year. We've got about 90 college chapters, 45 high school chapters. We engaged 11,100 students this year, which was this fall, which was, for the record, more double what we engaged last year. And I say all of that to articulate that I think people are craving honest connection. Because when they can then trust us and say, okay, this is why this person is telling me this idea, suddenly opens up their heart to the possibility of what is actually doable. I'll just share this last thing. Every one of these, and I'm sure y'all have seen this in your work, whether it's in Salmo or in Slovenia, you know, when one of our discussions ends, one of the most common things that our students will say, and it's even our chapter presidents, not just the students that are passionate about this work, and they'll say, wow, I did not think this was possible. So I think part of the challenge here is that people have been convinced that what we're trying to discuss at this conference is impossible. And if we leave this room with the assumption that, yeah, it's probably not going to happen, the folks that we try to meet are going to be able to sniff out that inauthenticity. So I think we have to really meet people where they are and understand their why. And I think that can open up a lot.
No, look, I think it's a terrific insight. My suspicion is people don't leave this conference thinking it's not possible, partly because these are a bunch of, I called a friend of mine here a degenerate do-gooder. You know, it's just like, can't help themselves. But I think what people oftentimes are concerned about is, does the dialogue, the sharing of stories, the understanding, the insight lead to action that in turn serves our communities? Because if it doesn't, then it starts feeling like a luxury. Nice to do, but we got bigger fish to fry. And so I want to ask each of you about this because, as I mentioned in my remarks, when you start trying to build bridges, you're vulnerable, not just that the other side rejects your overtures or lies to you or doesn't follow through on commitments, but you're also vulnerable within your own organizations, within your own communities and base. And you know, I'm sure all of you would sort of agree that things hurt worse, criticism hurts worse when it comes from your own oftentimes. And so I'm interested in how you think about managing your own allies, organizations, the people who are working alongside you consistently in your cause, and the possibility that they start feeling like you are selling out, letting folks down, which, by the way, I'll just shift to a political context here, happens across the political spectrum. I cannot tell you how many Republicans, when I was in the Senate and when I was president, I actually knew better, were oftentimes feeling as if they were taking positions they did not believe in because a base had been activated or a media personality had targeted them and said, you know, this is a Republican in name only, this is a sellout, and it had very real political consequences for them. A number of them ended up just leaving office altogether, not because they didn't necessarily have the stories that would surprise and encourage us about this, but because it was hard to take the heat from their own base. So I'm wondering if you've got stories to share that might help people think about that in a way that is useful. Good.
Sure. I think you bring up a really good point, which is the point of incentives. We've set up a structure in which where you win office, where you gain influence, where you make money is through outrage. You know, if you're on social media, the first thing that people will tell you is the way that you build an influence on a platform is by trying to play to the outrageous industrial complex, which is a lot of folks have coined that term as a way to articulate that outrage sits at the center of every decision we make. And this makes me think about the summit that we host every year, because I think a lot about how do you actually shift the real incentives, because the incentives right now do not align towards solving problems. The incentives align towards talking to the most ideological extremes on each side. So every year we host this annual summit where we bring together student leaders from across the country. It's 1 to 2 presidents from each chapter. And you'll meet the most ardent liberal students, the most ardent conservative students, not your sort of squishy middle. You'll meet different demographic groups, different identities. And I ask myself every time we host that summit, what actually unites everybody here? Like, why are they here? Because they're passionately and objectively advocating for a process, not an outcome. It's a process of pluralism. Why is that? Every time we come away from that conference, we realize that these students are united not by what they believe, but how they believe. There's a new divide, I think, in our politics. And I see that especially at the grassroots levels. And this is not elite college campuses and high schools across the country where our chapters work, in rural communities and urban communities. The new divide we see is a divide between the majority of people that believe in open-minded dialogue as a way to be able to see and understand each other, to feel heard, and the loud minority of folks that believe that the only way we win at this moment is through ideological rigidity. And when we start to think about it in the terms of there being a new divide, I've found personally that these students are motivated by seeing the fact that open-mindedness instead of closed-mindedness is the way that they're going to build their coalitions. That the way that they're going to achieve change is by realizing that the problem in their communities is not the problem of division necessarily, because we've been divided historically, but a problem of fear. And that fear being propagated by the loudest voices. So the question is, how do we elevate the majority of people that believe in the tenets of pluralism at a moment where it's necessary?
It's easier to say no to your own base, to reject, to know what compromises to reject and what compromises to take, when you are talking about a concrete goal and not talking in the abstract. And so this goes to the point I was making earlier about tying dialogue, work, bridge building with a goal that delivers for people. Yeah, so I was talking to some content creators earlier today, and I just used as a simple example that is fairly well known, the Affordable Care Act. I got whooped on throughout that process. Yeah, it wasn't single payer, there's no public option, there's this, there's that. And let me tell you, I know criticism is relative. When it's the president getting criticized, it's very noisy and very loud. And my staff is having to, catch all kinds of flack from various groups. But you know what? Generally speaking, we did not stress. I might occasionally curse, but did not stress about it because we had clarity about what we were trying to get done. And I think a lot of times, Manu, what you were referring to in terms of what's happening in the Twitterverse, the comments, this and that and the other, happens when it's not tied to something concrete. When it's tied to something concrete, you feel pressure because you now have to deliver. And that's where criticism is legitimate if you don't deliver. Or if somebody says, I think there's a better strategy to deliver. But if we're, when you're just talking ideologically, that's when I think the loudest voices, the most rigid voices tend to predominate. We're running out of time. So I'm going to just do I won't say this is a lightning round, but I'm going to just throw out a couple of things. Manu, obviously there was a lot of attention about college campuses, and, in the aftermath of October 7th in Gaza, and I'm interested in what kind of resolutions, not complete resolutions, but how did people think about rules governing how, if any, governing how people can voice their opinions, not in the settings you've set up, but more broadly, so that they don't feel as if they're being silenced, or they have to be overly polite when they feel on either side that the stakes are too high.
When you think about the work that's happening in colleges across the country and high schools across the country, the theme that everyone will echo in all of these discussions is this is one of the first times they felt loved. I'm being honest with you. I don't think we realize, at least, I don't know, I've not been doing this work as long as a lot of the folks here, and there's some amazing mentors that I've got here and a lot of great lightning talk speakers beforehand, but I think we underestimate how actually lonely people are. I really think we do. And I think we also don't actually realize that when we feel lonely, a lot of other people feel that same way. So when you think about inculcating an environment on a college campus or in high school, in an academic environment where the North Star is we're actually going to reward learning, where people are going to feel comfortable, because if they can't challenge each other's ideas here, where else are they going to challenge their ideas? I think the key lies in accurately diagnosing the problem. And I would posit to say that the problem is not division. The problem is not that there's too many ideas and we can't figure it out. The problem is that there's a culture of fear. And that culture of fear is built not by most people in this room, or frankly, most people in American society. That culture of fear is built by the loud minority of voices that benefit from being loud. And so what we've got to do is we've got to figure out, how do you elevate the majority of people that care about this work? How do you build the permission structure? So when it comes to policies, how do you incentivize pluralism as the norm? When a student shows up to campus, how do you create faculty interventions? How do you ensure that their dorm life is politically and ideologically diverse? And here's the coolest thing about our chapters. People actually make friends with people that are different than them and leave the room saying, I actually learned more from this friendship. And when people can actually feel that this isn't some fake prescription, but it is core to their soul, that is a part of the human condition. I mean, you discuss the legacy of our democracy in a really articulate way. By 2045, the United States is going to be the most diverse democracy in the history of democracies. This has never happened before. Imagine I told you there was a society of 330 million people, all of whom look differently than each other, heavily armed, trying to make it work. So I would just articulate that I think this work is offense. And I think young people are ready to pick up the mantle of dialogue because they see this as the tool for the moment right now.
Okay. Well, look, I could not be prouder of the work that all of you are doing, and the way you articulate and describe your work, I'm sure has inspired the audience. Not just here in the auditorium, but folks who are watching. I just want to emphasize to everybody that you can hear the degree to which these are some soft-hearted but hard-headed people. They're not doing this because they've got nothing else to do, and they are looking for practical results. And that, I think, maybe is a thought to leave all of you with. This idea that there is a contradiction between listening to others, hearing their stories, identifying potential connections, that there's a contradiction between that and your convictions. That somehow, if you really have convictions, then you aren't interested in that. That's something I really want to dispel. And just to give you one final example of the practical benefit of what we're talking about, for you to achieve the aims that you have, I'll just use a very brief example. I was elected president primarily because of a bunch of 20-something-year-olds who were running around Iowa for a year. And they'd just be parachuted into these communities, and they'd be living with some family, and you got some black guy from Brooklyn, suddenly he's never seen corn, he's with corn and cows, and you got some Asian guy from San Francisco, and he's running around, trying to like be an assistant coach for Little League, even though he didn't play baseball, and they're there all the time. So I'm getting all kinds of stories from these folks. I think the most important story that I got from these folks who really were responsible for our first victory in Iowa and then launched the rest of my campaign, the most important story for today is the story from one of our volunteers who is now a speechwriter for Michelle, outstanding, and he tells me he comes back, he comes back from canvassing, knocking on doors, talking to people about our campaign, and he describes how he knocks on a door in sort of a rural, pretty conservative area. Woman opens the door. My guy says, I'm here for the Obama campaign. He's got all the paraphernalia, and we're just trying to find out, if we can count on your support for the caucuses. And the woman says, hold on, and turns back into the house and yells at her husband, honey, who are we supporting in the caucus? And he says, yeah, we're supporting the N-word. Yeah, we're supporting the, and she turns back and says, yeah, we're supporting Obama. And my canvasser marks it down. 2 points from that. 1, it's a game of addition. 2, I was more confident about that person was going to support me in the caucus. Because hope is honest. And that was honest. All right, everybody. Give these guys a big round of applause. They were fantastic.